Thank you, Bishop, and thank you for all coming. The reason we're reversing the order is that I am a genuine certified absent-minded professor, and I left my notes for the C.S. Lewis book home, so I'm going to have to reconstruct them tonight. So we'll start with Charles Williams' delightful little tale, Descent into Hell. My philosophy of teaching is that the worst kind of teaching is monologue, just a lecture, which I'm forced to engage in. A little better is dialogue, and even a lecturer can dialogue with the author of the text, but the best philosophy of teaching is a trialogue, where the professor's voice, the author's voice, and the student's voice are all heard. So to preserve order, since this is not a classroom, I won't interrupt myself and ask for questions every couple of minutes, but at the end, you are commanded to ask some questions, and if there are no questions, the meetings will begin. Whenever I assign this book, Charles Williams' Descent into Hell, in philosophy and literature classes, which I teach quite often, I always get from at least one student, sometimes quite a few students, the following reaction, which I never get to any other book. Professor, I know there's going to be a test on this, but I'm sorry, I just cannot finish the book. I was overcome by such a fear and such a feeling of dread that I think I may go insane if I finish the book. That's a rather extreme version of it. But this is the single most terrifying book I have ever read outside the Bible. By the way, Bibles ought to come with warning labels. Why? Well, because it's about hell, and it makes hell quite believable. Quite an achievement to a modern audience. Let's see how he does it. It's a story, and every story has 5 dimensions. So let's look at the 5 basic dimensions of this story. The first dimension is the characters, because the story has to be about a person, otherwise it's boring. And the second dimension is the setting. They have to be somewhere. And the third dimension is the plot. Something has to happen. And the fourth dimension is the style. You're telling the story in words. And finally, the fifth dimension is the theme. Every story has some, at least implicit, philosophical theme. So let's start with the characters. The 2 main characters of this book are called Lawrence Wentworth and Peter Stanhope. The words are invented and symbolic. Wentworth descends into hell. His worth went. Peter Stanhope is a kind of apostle or angel figure who stands on his hope and mediates heaven to the main protagonist who stands between the two in making choices. That's Pauline and Strother. Pauline is initiated into some of the mysteries of Jacob's ladder, ways of ascending into heaven while on earth. Wentworth is initiated into some of the mysteries of Satan's ladder, how to descend into hell while still on earth. What happens in this book is a man goes to hell during his life on earth. A very strange thing. But then Williams is a master of strangeness. In one of his novels, All Hallows Eve, the 2 protagonists die on page 1. And there are no flashbacks. And the story is about this world. Figure that one out. In another of his novels, The Place of the Lion, the protagonists are Platonic ideas, which incarnate themselves with appalling power in this world. I know of no novel ever written that's like that. Pauline is introduced in the first page as a troubled, joyless woman, basically good, but full of fears. And she has a nightmare, a recurring nightmare, which apparently Goethe also had, of her own doppelganger, that is, her own dark side, her own ghost self. And it gets closer and closer in each dream. And she knows that when it gets so close that it touches her, she will die. She's terrified. And nothing can remove this fear from her. Until Peter Stanhope comes, and says, haven't you ever heard of the way of exchange? What is the way of exchange? Well, it's something that Williams taught in many of his works, which C.S. Lewis, his best friend, apparently actually practiced at the hospital bed of his dying wife, Joy, through the mediation of a priest. I'm not sure exactly what the roles of each of these persons are, but when he was there, the pain left her legs and entered his. Stanhope asks, haven't you heard that we ought to bear one another's burdens? Pauline said, but that means, I know, Stanhope said, you think it means listening sympathetically and thinking unselfishly and that sort of thing. Well, I don't say a word against all that, but it's more like carrying a parcel instead of someone else. To bear someone else's burden is precisely to carry it instead of. If you're still carrying yours, I'm not carrying it for you, however sympathetic I may be. Now, at this point, Pauline is not explicitly a Christian, and this is, of course, a Christian theme, because this is the theology of the atonement. This is what Christ did for us. So Peter says, well, there's no need to introduce Christ unless you wish, but it's a fact of experience. If you give a weight to me, you can't be carrying it yourself. So all I'm asking you to do is notice that blazing truth. It doesn't sound very difficult. And if I could, she said, if I could do this, whatever it is you mean, would I? Would I push my burden onto someone else? No, not if you insist on making a universe for yourself, he answered. If you want to disobey and refuse the laws that are common to us all, if you want to live in pride and division and anger, you can. But if you will be part of the best of us and live and laugh and be ashamed with us, then you must be content to be helped. You must give your burden up to someone else, and then you must carry someone else's burden for them. I haven't made the universe. It isn't my fault, but I'm sure that this is a law of the universe. And not to give up your burden is as much to rebel as not to carry another's. So we all should be a burden to our families. This is one of our tasks. I remember the first time I taught this book, 2 students came up to me afterwards. And they said, do you believe this stuff? I said, I have no reason to disbelieve it. Why do you ask? Well, we were talking about the book, and we each have a psychological burden, and we didn't think that anybody else could carry it for us, but now we hope that it might be true. And they made sure no other students were around because it was rather embarrassing. One rather mature and attractive and competent woman said, well, my burden is I have fear of flying. And I have a very prestigious job, and it requires flying, and I have to quit my job, and I don't know what else to do. And then the man said, well, mine is even more embarrassing. I'm afraid to take a bath because I think I might go down the drain. So I just have to wash myself with a washcloth, and sometimes that isn't adequate. Could we exchange burdens? Since she's not afraid of going down the drain and I'm not afraid of flying, then maybe when she's afraid of flying, she could just call me up and say, I have to take a flight, and I could say, well, okay, I'll be afraid for you. And when I have to take a bath, I'll call her up, and she said, okay, I'll be afraid of going down the drain with you because we have enough imaginative sympathy to do that. Do you think it could work? I said, I see no harm in trying it. I don't know. The next day they came to class with big smiles. He had taken a bath every day, and she had taken a couple of flights. Can this be done? Can we exchange each other's burdens? Well, of course. Oh, well, we can carry each other's suitcases, yes, but is there such a distinction between the laws of matter and the laws of mind? Is there such a split between the 2 dimensions of the universe that we can't do that in the mental and emotional dimension? Why should there be? And when we do it, what is it like? Well, as Charles Williams writes, when Pauline does give Peter her burden, he bore it, and the burden was inevitably lighter for him than for her, for the rage of a personal resentment was lacking. He endured her sensitivity, but not her sin. The substitution there, if indeed there is a substitution, is hidden in the central mystery of Christendom, which Christendom itself has never fully understood, nor can. Since he could not take, nor would have admitted, her hate and rejection, her passion was received into the lucidity and peace of his own spirit. Well, that's what goes on between those two characters. Not only does he bear her burden, she then finds that she has to bear someone else's burden. And it turns out to be a member of her family who died centuries before as a martyr. And the records of his martyrdom show great sanctity. So they set him at the stake and put fire to the wood, and as the fire got hold of him, he gave a loud cry and said, "I have seen the salvation of my God." And he spoke this many times until he died, which was held for a testimony that the Lord had done great things for him there in the midst of the fire. And the place was called Struther's Salvation for many years. This is a story which went around her family. She knew this. But one day she receives a vision from this martyred ancestor across the centuries of time, confessing that he is terrified of fire, and he knows that tomorrow, when he is scheduled to be burned at the stake, he will blaspheme and he will say anything to avoid the fear. He's praying in prison, "Lord God, I cannot bear the fear of the fire." And Pauline hears this, and she offers to bear it for him. And he thinks that she is an angel of God. And in a sense, she is. That's her job. She's a messenger. And it works. It happens. Her own voice said, seemingly from behind her, "Give the burden to me, John Struther." He heard it in his cell in chains, as the first dawn of the day of his martyrdom broke beyond the prison. It spoke and sprang in his drained heart, and drove the riotous blood again through his veins. Give it to me, John Struther." He stretched out his arms again. He called, "Lord, Lord." It was an adoration. It accepted. Pauline heard it, trembling, for she knew what stood behind her, and spoke. It said again, "Give it to me." He fell on his knees, and in a great roar of triumph he cried, "I have seen the salvation of my God." If that sounds strange, it shouldn't, if we understand what happened in the Gospels. Unless we understand that as a freak, an exception, something that has very little relevance to our lives. If Christ is thoroughly human, he reveals to us not merely who God is, but who man is. And perhaps man is not simply I, but we, like God. And in that case, the relations between us are much more mysterious and much more intimate than we can possibly imagine. Both of these people are troubled souls. We're all troubled souls once we stop fooling ourselves. Pauline is an unhappy girl, good but unhappy. And that very unhappiness is used as part of the exchange. It gives joy to her ancestor. It had been her incapacity for joy that till now had turned the vision of herself aside. She knew that all acts of love are the measure of capacity for joy. So she offered her joy to her betrayed ancestor. She had lived without joy so that he might die in joy. She knew it now, from the abundant grace of that place or that hour, but the exchange might be made between many mortal hearts without any knowing what work was done in that moment's divine kingdom. Well, that's the good news. The bad news centers on Lawrence Wentworth, the character who descends into hell. And his hell is not a Dante-esque hell, that is, when Dante is misinterpreted as not allegory but literal. If you're interested in the details of hell, don't read Dante. If you are interested in the details of the road to hell, read Dante. But this hell is a rather modern psychological hell, which I think is quite theologically accurate, because one of the saints, I forget who, said that I don't believe there's literal fire in hell because fire is a beautiful thing and God created it and it's very good and there's nothing good in hell. So that if there were literal fire in hell, I don't think it would be so bad because the damned could then say, how beautiful your fire is, Lord. And there's something outside of them that they love more than themselves, or that can, at least that they can appreciate. So I don't think there's anything in hell but yourself. And I think the souls in hell would wish that there were such a thing as fire and an external torture, because the internal torture is always much worse. So that picture of hell, eternal and absolute loneliness, is the picture that you get here. It's both a more credible and a more terrifying picture. Lawrence Wentworth, of course, gradually descends into hell. Almost always the gradual approach is much more effective. One of the obvious characteristics of that road to hell is lovelessness. Wentworth had never had a friend or a lover, or been one. He had never, in any sense of the word, been in love. Yet, or perhaps therefore, his life had been quite pleasant to him. Sleep had all of his life been a pleasant thing to Lawrence Wentworth. He's contrasted with, he's a scholar, and he's contrasted with a rival scholar who, instead of cultivating his own pleasure and security, cultivates self-forgetful devotion to his scholarship, to truth. Aston Moffat, by now almost 70, derived a great deal of intellectual joy from expounding his point of view. He was a pure scholar, a holy and beautiful soul who would have sacrificed reputation, income, and life, if necessary, for the discovery of one fact. Wentworth raged secretly as he wrote his letters of refutation of Moffat, and he drew up his evidence. He identified scholarship with himself. He asserted himself under the disguise of a defense of scholarship. He refused to admit that the exact details of history was not, in fact, worth to him the cost of a single cigar, though it was his career. Well, that's a bad habit, and bad habits are dangerous because they're roads. And he continues to go down that road, making choices along the way, which seem very small, and yet appearance is sometimes greater than reality. When he discovers that it's his rival rather than he who has received a knighthood, when he reads this in the paper, there was, all sin, of course, is stupid. I'm convinced that we're all insane. This is my definition of original sin. Dozens of times a day, God offers us the choice between joy and misery. Here he says, I have two hands, not just one. And you have the choice between my right hand, in which is the secret of joy, my will be done, and my left hand, in which is the secret of misery, your will be done. Now, in giving you free will, I say to you, your will be done. Will you return to me the compliment and choose my right hand? And we say, you know, Lord, that's true. Every single time I've chosen your right hand, your will, I've experienced joy, deep, lasting joy. And every time I've chosen the left hand, I've experienced misery. So I know that's true. Now, you offer me the choice again. Gee, that's a tough one, God. I don't know. Let me try the left hand. Maybe it'll work again this time. Einstein once defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result the next time. We're nuts. And that's what's so scary about this book. It's about us. There's a Lawrence Wentworth in us. Any single human being in history could go to hell. St. Paul himself worried about going to hell. Wentworth determined then and forever that he would hate that fact and therefore all facts. To hate fact, to hate truth, to hate that which enlightens rather than darkens. That perhaps is the unforgivable sin, because no matter how good the surgeon is and how good the hospital is and how good the instruments are, you can't do any operation if the lights go out. Wentworth is also in love with a girl named Adela who does not love him back. And in a very strange twist of the plot, a false Adela, who is actually a succubus, an evil spirit posing as a woman, offers herself to him instead as his totally obedient companion. And of course he accepts. It's not, I think, ordinary, normal, or literal, whether Williams literally believed that demons could impersonate human beings in this way or not, I don't know. But it certainly is a very accurate symbol of the primal sin, pride. I'm God, I'm the center of the universe. Truth comes from me, not to me. Along the way, he becomes more and more obsessed with himself and rejecting of the world outside him. And he has offered opportunities to come outside of himself into the world of truth and rejects them, all small ones. But God gives you many, many chances. Christ even gave Judas a chance in the Garden of Gethsemane. Friend, why have you come here? He calls him friend. Even that didn't change him. His last choice, as a historian, he's consulted about a play and whether the costumes are historically correct. He's an expert historian. And he doesn't want to bother. And they asked him, are the costumes and the guard correct? In one flash, he saw that they were not. And at this point of decision, he could do what the honor of his scholarship commanded. He could have them returned. It meant only his being busy with them that one evening and concerning himself with something different from his closed garden. He smelled the garden. He said, yes, they're correct. It was over. He could go into his little enclosed garden, the garden of his own soul. To go from the characters to the plot, let's go right to the end of the book. Here is the picture of his final damnation. He simply goes to a public meeting that he is obliged to go to and sits in a chair and does nothing else. He would always sit there. He sat down. As he did so, he knew he was lost. He wanted desperately to hold on to the rope. He's had a dream of climbing down a rope. And he hopes that at the bottom of the rope he'll meet something interesting. The rope was no longer there. He believed that there would be for him a companion at the bottom of the rope who would satisfy him forever. And now he was there at the bottom, and there was nothing but meaningless noises and visions. The rope was not there. There were faces, but they ceased to be faces. They became blobs of whitish red and yellow, working and twisting in a horrible way that yet did not surprise him because nothing could surprise him. He was sitting at the end, looking up an avenue of nothingness, and the little flames licked his soul, but they did not now come from without, for they were the power and the only power his dead past had on him, the life and the only life of his soul. He waited for something to happen. The silence lasted. Nothing happened. In that pause, all hope and expectancy faded. The shape went out, and he was drawn steadily, everlastingly, inward and down through the bottomless circles of the void. I told you it was a scary book. In the plot, Wentworth is contrasted not only with Pauline, who in a sense ascends to heaven, but also with a nameless suicide who apparently is on the way to hell, but who is saved. Because God sees what's deepest in his heart. The suicide is described this way. His name no one troubled to know. He was hungry, he was ill, he was clumsy, he was slow. His life seemed to him an endless gutter down which ran an endless voice. The republic of which he knew nothing had betrayed him. That's a technical term for Williams. It's not a political term, it's a mystical term. The city. It's Augustine's Civitas Dei, the city of God. It's what the Russian Orthodox often mean by sobornost, one of the key themes in Dostoevsky. It's the interaction and interdependence of all human beings in the world. Many of the Russian mystics say, just as the physical world is governed by universal gravity, so the spiritual world is governed by a universal gravity of souls called love. And if you touch any one soul, you influence all souls. You'll frequently find, if you read the Russian Orthodox mystics, statements like, if you go home this afternoon and do one little act of charity to somebody in your family, the result will be that 300 years from now, somebody that you never heard of and never heard of you will receive enough grace to overcome his temptations or his trials. If not, not. And if you do one little act of uncharity to somebody that seems to be unimportant to you, then the result will be that 300 years from now, someone you have never met will repudiate the grace that's offered to him. Because everything touches everything, materially, and why shouldn't every soul touch every soul spiritually? So there are no victimless crimes. Just as in your body, everything influences everything. If there's an infection in your foot, the white corpuscles rush from all parts of your body to combat it. If you have a stone in your shoe, you can't think rightly. Well, we are all one body, and whatever harms one organ harms all, and whatever helps one helps all. So there are no victimless crimes. That's Williams's vision. And that is really the setting of the story. The setting is London, and the setting is the theater, and it's realistically described. But the mystical setting, the cosmological setting, is the most important one. And in that setting, past and present meet. If the spirit of a man at death saw truly what he was and had been, so that a lucid power of intelligence manifested all himself to him, then that energy of knowledge was especially urgent upon men and women here. In other words, life and death interpenetrate. Life is a literal rehearsal for death. At a rehearsal, you actually do the thing you're rehearsing for. The neighborhood of the dead troubled the living. Wentworth's house is the very house that the suicide committed suicide in centuries before. So in that single place, these two times meet. Since the suicide sought that which Wentworth did not seek, namely love and companionship, though he did not find it, he was saved. He was offered at the point of death the salvation he was never offered during life, and accepted it. But he's shocked when he realizes, after he committed suicide, that you can't commit suicide. Suicide, like divorce, is an illusion, something that seems to exist but doesn't. Something eternal cannot be killed. And persons are eternal, both the single flesh that each individual is and the one flesh that a validly married couple is. He had supposed he had wanted to die, and only at the last he discovered that he wanted also not to die. But he also wanted not to live, and these two rejections blurred his brain and shook his body. By the latter, he stood still, holding on to it, utterly defeated at last, in a despair that even he had never felt before. There had always been present to him, unrecognized but secure, man's last hope, the possibility of death. It may be refused, but the refusal, even the unrecognized refusal, admits hope. I think it's Viktor Frankl, the great psychologist who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, who says that he asks his patients who come to him deeply troubled, "Why haven't you committed suicide?" And they say, "Are you advising me to do so? Oh, no, no. In fact, you have deliberately chosen not to commit suicide. Anybody can do it at any time. Why haven't you? And their answer is their life's meaning. There is some reason for me to live rather than to die. Without the knowledge of his capacity of death, however much he may fear it, man is desolate. And now this hope had gone. He had no chance whatever. The rope was gone. He could not die, for he was already dead. All cases that I have read about of people who have committed suicide and returned, whether through CPR or some other medical means, have said the same thing. Namely, that they tried to escape that which they could not escape. And if they had this full vision, as this man had, then they realize that mistake and they don't try it again. But even if horizontally souls are dependent on other souls in this intimate way, how can the verticality of time work that way? How can the past and the present work in tandem? On a horizontal road, you can go east or west. But on a vertical road, you can't go both up and down. So doesn't causality work only from the past into the future rather than vice versa? How could a 20th century girl, Pauline, cause something to happen in the 16th century to her own ancestor? How can causality work backwards? How can time work that way? Well, if you're dealing with eternity, you're not dealing with time. You're dealing with something else, something greater. When my youngest daughter was 6 years old, she was diagnosed as having a malignant and inoperable brain tumor, and they gave her 6 months to live. And we asked for miracles, and we asked for prayers, and we got them, and she's fine. She's 40 years old. She's a clinical psychologist, married with 2 kids. We got our miracle. But one of my students, who was a very bright and personable friend of mine, who was an atheist, I asked him to pray too. And he said, you know, I'm an atheist. I said, yeah, but God isn't. So he listens to your prayers, even though you don't listen to his. So he laughed at that and said, okay, I'll pray. To whom it may concern. I said, thank you. So after we got the miracle, I thanked him for his prayers. And he said, look, even if there is a God, you must know enough about the laws of physics to realize that my prayer couldn't have made any difference, because you told me that they discovered at the operation that it was not the kind of tumor that they thought it was and that showed up on the CAT scan. It was not a malignant tumor. It was a benign tumor, a totally different kind of tumor. This was, the surgeon said, a tumor that she had been born with 5 years ago. So how could a prayer in 1975 have possibly changed an event in 1970? He was a very intelligent student. So I said, well, look, if there is a God, he's not in time. He's in eternity. So when you're dealing with him, you're not dealing across the board. You're dealing with eternity. All things are present to him. So why couldn't causality work? Neither backwards nor forward, but instantaneously. As you did when you wrote that brilliant poem for me that I gave you an A+ on. Didn't it all come to you at once? He said, yeah, I guess I was a little bit like God that way, wasn't I? Once Pauline realizes that she's living in that kind of world, the world in which we see only the scrim on the beach. We see just the surface. And there's immense powers happening behind the scenes. She's terrified, but wonderfully terrified. She felt a low but immense arc rising above the horizon of her world, or perhaps of the earth itself, the hint of a new organization of all things, a shape, of incredible difficulty in the finding, of incredible simplicity once found, the shape of an infinitely alien arrangement of infinitely familiar things. Her ancestor was not there. He was dead centuries since, if centuries meant anything, but perhaps they didn't. Perhaps everything was all at once to omnipotence, who therefore, when he steps into time, says, "Behold, I make all things new." That's my candidate for the greatest line in the history of cinema. You remember it from the Passion of the Christ. Christ is carrying his cross and is about to change everything. And Mary is watching him in agony and doesn't understand why he has to do all this. And she says something like, "Why do you have to do it this way?" And he looks at her and says, "See, Mother, I am making all things new." Only eternity can do that. There are places, even in this world, that are haunted by the presence of the dead. Gettysburg, the Colosseum in Rome. Maybe the whole world is similarly haunted. Williams lifts up the curtain a little bit and sees and shows us a little of what might be, just a tiny bit of this larger horizon, which is very good, but at the same time terrifying. Like Aslan. He's not safe, but he's good. The fundamental theme of the book, I think, philosophically, is the absoluteness of truth and the redemptive power of truth and the choice between heaven and hell as ultimately a choice between light and darkness, not just morally, not just between good and evil, that too, of course, but also between truth and untruth, between objective truth and subjective truth, between letting God be God and playing God. Between not just saying, "My will be done" versus "Thy will be done," that too, of course, but identical with that, my truth or your truth. What Wentworth rejects is truth. And if there's any one candidate for the unforgivable sin, I think that's it. Because no matter what comes to you, if you reject everything that comes to you, if you reject everything but yourself, you're already in hell. In the last battle, you may remember, when the world ends and the true God, Aslan, appears, the dwarfs, who have no faith and no hope and no trust, sit there with their eyes closed, and they say the dwarves are from the dwarves, or for the dwarves. And Aslan can't break through that. He shines the light on them, but they close their eyes and they're in the darkness. One of the saints says, I think this is St. Catherine, "I suspect that heaven and hell are the same place. They're the light of God. But it tortures those who hate the light, and it blesses those who love it." Cardinal Newman has a sermon about that. He says, imagine taking somebody who hates beauty and hates the church to a high mass with magnificent music and making him sit in the front row through 2 hours of this beauty. It would be hell to him. To everybody else in the congregation, it's heaven. Oh, I have to leave some time left. So rather than go further into this theme, which is rather abstract and philosophical, let me just briefly mention the style. If you want to read this book, and you should, be prepared for a wrestling contest. It's not a simple book. First of all, it's mystical, it's visionary. You can't just look at it, you have to look along it. Secondly, you have to have an imagination. You have to have an analogical imagination. You can't be too literalistic. Throw away your computers and get out your poetry. But this is a book everybody should read. It's a shattering book, but unless your heart is shattered, it's not complete. I'm going to give myself the hook at this point and ask for questions.
right, Dr. Kreeft. First question is trading of burdens and descent into hell an illustration of William's doctrine of co-inference?
Co-inheritance, yes. We inhere in each other. When somebody that you deeply love dies, not only do you feel deprived and perhaps even betrayed, but everything in the world seems to lack life. The color has gone out of everything. Why is that? A large portion of your life has gone, but the rest of it seems to also have been gone. Why is that? Well, the reason is that that person was a part of you. That person was your third eye. And now you look at the world only with your own eyes. And it lacks that sense of depth, that sense of perspective. A friend is not somebody that you look at, but somebody that you look with, like a pair of eyeglasses. And that perspective is gone now. And therefore the whole world is, in a sense, gone. Well, that's, I think, an empirical, experiential piece of evidence for the fact that we inhere in each other. And if that's true, if that's not just a psychological trick we play on ourselves, then that's something that God has put into the human situation to be used. Therefore, the fundamental commandment, love, is not just a moral ideal. It's a statement of mathematical accuracy. When Dante insists that Beatrice actually is the almost goddess that he makes her out to be, especially in the Vita Nuova, as well as in the Divine Comedy, he says, this is not my poetic fancy. This is a vision of what she is. And unlike most romantic lovers, Dante was wise enough to realize that this was not individual and peculiar and subjective to him. This was a universal principle. If we saw each other, we would see each other as images of God. We would look along each other and see the light of God flowing through each other. I'm not sure it was Charles Williams, maybe it was, some theologian said, if we only understood everything St. Paul meant when he ever used the word in all of his epistles, we would have nothing left to understand. We'd know all of Christian theology. I am in the Father is in me. We are in Christ, Christ is in us. We are in each other. That co-inherence is a fundamental principle in Christian theology, but it's mystical, and therefore we don't hear too much about it, alas.
Why do you think God created imagination in human beings? Also, how does imagination draw us closer to God?
Since we're made in God's image, and since the imagination is part of our spiritual soul, God must have done this because he himself has an imagination. He can be outside of himself and into us. One of the most debilitating of all mental illnesses is Asperger's syndrome. And one of the characteristics of Asperger's syndrome is the lack of the moral imagination. That is, you can't put yourself into somebody else's shoes. How would you feel if somebody did that to you, what you've just done to them? The question is meaningless to someone who has a deep version of Asperger's syndrome. Well, that's a defect in the very image of God. So the imagination is not just some extra. And the image of God is not limited to simply reason and free will. In fact, if you don't have an imagination, it's very, very difficult to be a saint. How can you practice the golden rule without an imagination? Do unto others what you would have, would want to have, can imagine, therefore, others doing to you. So it's a divine gift that we have a duty to cultivate.
Can you briefly discuss how the friendship between Lewis and Williams developed? And is this what drove a wedge between Lewis and Tolkien?
Yes and no. Lewis discovered Williams when he read The Place of the Lion. Williams was not an academic, he was an editor at a press in London. Lewis invited him to come to Oxford, and he thoroughly charmed a group of disciples and gave many lectures at Oxford. Lewis was deeply influenced by Williams. Tolkien was not, but that did not drive a wedge between Lewis and Tolkien. Nothing drove a wedge between Lewis and Tolkien. They saw less of each other after Lewis married. But that, too, did not drive a wedge between them, although Tolkien didn't think that much of Joy, didn't hate her. Those rumors are vastly exaggerated. So they were close friends. Lewis was once asked what was the relationships among the Inklings? Did you influence Williams? Did Williams influence you? Did you influence Tolkien? Did Tolkien influence you? And he answered the questions, yes, Williams influenced me very deeply, and so did Tolkien. I don't know whether I influenced Williams at all. As far as influencing Tolkien is concerned, one could speak of influencing Tolkien only in the sense that one could influence a Bandersnatch. If you know Jabberwocky. No one influenced Tolkien. He was his own man.
What has been the reaction of agnostic/atheist students to this book? Has it had traction with them?
I don't know. I never got a personal reaction from atheist or agnostic students that I know of to the book, but a number of students disliked it intensely for whatever reasons. I probably should have followed that up and questioned them more about it, but I didn't want to ruffle their feathers. You know, academics are cowards.
That is all the questions I have via email. Is there someone here who would like to ask a question?
The air is at least as sacred as email, so yes. I didn't hear all the words in that question. So it's something about what I think about Lewis's image of hell, but could you repeat it completely so I can answer it more completely?
In the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis has Aslan as his image of Christ and Jadis as his image of the devil. Have you ever found a way in which he creates an image of hell itself?
Well, I mentioned the dwarfs in the last battle. No, there are demon figures. Jadis is one of them. But there's nobody who actually is described as going to hell, although Susan has rejected Narnia and presumably has rejected Aslan, but that's not followed up. No, it's the Screwtape Letters that you have to read to get Lewis's image of hell, and the hell chapter in The Problem of Pain, which is the most clear and accurate theological defense of the most difficult and indefensible of all Christian doctrines that I've ever read.
Dr. Kreeft, Father Chris Culpepper, I was intrigued by your comments earlier, and I know this can't be pressed too far, and I'm not even sure I can formulate my question that I want to ask, but hell doesn't contain a fire. Fire's created by God. It's good. It's outside of us. In that idea of hell being self and isolation, what part of self remains, being that self is created in the image of God?
That's a brilliantly difficult question, because the image of God is the self. We can say I. And once and only once did God reveal his own essential eternal name to Moses in the burning bush, and that was the word, I am. So somehow that is destroyed in hell. The demoniac that Jesus met in Gadarene said, "What is your name?" He received this answer, "Our name is Legion, for we are many." He can't say I anymore. So in a sense, Lewis says, no self goes to hell. What goes to hell is remains. What used to be a self. Which, if it is true, and I think it is, answers another very difficult question. How could we ever be happy in heaven if we knew that somebody we loved is in hell? And the answer is, nobody that you love is in hell, because that's not a person anymore. That once was a person, and if you could live in the past, you would bemoan it. But in heaven, you don't live in the past, you live in the present. Suppose you have a beautiful work of art, and it falls into the furnace and dies. You bemoan it because you remember how beautiful it was. But when you look at the present, it's just ashes.
It's kind of the image of the unman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's not a man. If you burn something, and fire, of course, is a symbol of burning and destruction. If you burn a log, you get ashes. It's something, but it's not a log. So if you burn a soul, you get that which was once a soul, but is now the shards and remains of a soul. In other words, hell is where you go to make an ash of yourself.
Dr. Kreeft, if in heaven we are in eternity, can we go back in time and forward in time and see what happened and is going to happen?
I think so. Because God sees everything at once. And even in this life, we have little analogies of that. For instance, somebody says to you, have you ever read The Lord of the Rings? And you say, no, I haven't. And then you read it. And you remember everything in it. And then somebody asks you the same question, have you ever read The Lord of the Rings? And you say yes. And when he says The Lord of the Rings, what do you think of? The first part, the hobbits, the next part, the Black Riders, the next part, the trip to Mordor, the last part, the return to the Shire? No, all of it at once. But it takes years. Yeah, but you have all of it at once because you're outside the book. Well, God is outside the book that he writes, which is history, as well as inside it in Christ. So when you read a book, you're having a kind of an analogy of heavenly mystical experience, transcending the time of the book. Of course, we can only do that by being in another kind of time. It takes time to read a book. And there's where the analogy fails. God is not in his own time. He has no past or future. Everything is present to him. But when we say he has no past or future, that's not a lack. It's our time that's a lack. Our past is no more, and our future is not yet. But what we call past is to God, and what we call future is to God. So it's all there in the present, eternal present. And in some creaturely fashion, we will participate in that, although we can hardly imagine the fashion.
So if we are in that kairos, will we still be experiencing the emotions of chronos? Because the famous verse, all tears will be wiped away. We have a picture that there will be no more sorrow, but if we are truly able to do that, it seems that just as God is grieved by things that are happening in our present, so we would be.
There are three answers to that question, two false, one true. There's the Stoic answer, the Christian answer, and the answer of pop psychology. To the Stoics, emotions are all animal emotions, not part of our humanity, and we should rise above them. To pop psychology, we are all emotion through and through. To Christianity, there are animal emotions and there are spiritual emotions. Emotions are part of the image of God in us, part of the heart. We have emotions that animals do not have. Compassion, sympathy, intuition. And these, since they're part of the image of God, are preserved and perfected in heaven. On the other hand, animal emotions like physical pain and hunger, these will be transcended. God wipes all tears away. If you want a very good philosophical treatment of that question of the emotions in Christian theology, I recommend a little book called The Heart by Dietrich von Hildebrand. It's a bit philosophical, but not that difficult.
Charles Williams has brilliant concepts. I'm just wondering if you believe that he is a good writer and his books are well written from a literary perspective.
No. But that's not his fault. If he had confined himself to Harry Potter kind of stuff, he would have been a much more famous and successful writer because people could grasp it. Instead, he wanted to penetrate through to the difficult things, the mystical themes. And therefore, he gives his relatively few readers very precious and unique insights, rather than giving to 10 times as many readers insights that they could have gotten anywhere else.
Short question. I've heard several different pronunciations of your name. How do you pronounce it?
I pronounce it any way you do. It's Kreeft. It's Dutch. It means lobster. Kreeft. Kreeft is Americanized. I don't mind that. In fact, I'm rather more proud of being American than of being Dutch, because it's my people who invented apartheid, euthanasia, legalized drug addiction, prostitution, threw stones at Pope Paul VI when he came to Amsterdam. We're pretty decadent.
How would Williams have reflected on Gollum and his loss of self, losing himself and not being able to say the word I? Is his life then the living hell? And in his final act, is that an act of salvation or an act of judgment?
Well, when Tolkien writes about that scene, he writes about it from Frodo's point of view rather than from Gollum's point of view. So we're deliberately left with ambiguity. Is there any possibility of Gollum's salvation? Frodo thinks there is. Sam thinks there isn't. Frodo's right, Sam's wrong. That's the conflict between Frodo and Sam, which is very gentle in the book and vastly overdone in Peter Jackson's version of the movie. But Tolkien writes in one of his letters something I find very brilliant. He says, I love the old epics, which are stories about the conflict between good and evil, the deepest of all plots. But the problem with all the epics is that you have to identify with the characters. Otherwise, the story doesn't move you. And there's a good guy and a bad guy. All right? Identify with the bad guy, that's no good. Okay, so identify with the good guy, fine. But the good guy always wins. So you feel proud and arrogant. But if the good guy doesn't win, then you've got a false theology. Evil's stronger than good. So how does he solve that problem? Well, obviously Frodo's the good guy, and Gollum's the bad guy, and the good guys win in the end, but he avoids the problem of pride. Gee, I'm like Frodo, I could be a hero. Frodo's not a hero. Frodo rats in the end. He becomes Gollum. I do not choose to give you the ring. I take the ring for myself. And Gollum becomes Frodo, not internally, but externally. He does the task of destroying the ring. So, thank God for Gollum. And I suppose we should pray for the Gollums that we see in this world. There's always hope while there's life. And realize that the greatest of saints is only like Frodo. We have limits. All the saints are very clear about that they're sinners. In other words, there's only two kinds of people in the world. Saints who know that they're sinners, and sinners who think that they're